Welcome to a new video lesson. In today's lesson, I will analyze some of the chapters of Pride and Prejudice. So, let's begin. Today, we will start with chapter 43 of Pride and Prejudice. This chapter shows the thorough change in both the characters, in the character of Darcy and Elizabeth. And this chapter is concerned with the visit of Elizabeth to Pemberley. Okay, so Elizabeth is delighted at the sight of Pemberley house and the natural beauty of the grounds. For a moment, she feels to be a mistress of Pemberley might be an attractive thing to be done. The housekeeper shows them round the house, which is tastefully furnished. Wonderful views are seen from the windows. The housekeeper informs that Darcy is expected the next day with a large party of friends. They saw miniatures of Wickham, Darcy and his sister. The housekeeper tells them that Wickham is wild, but that Darcy is a sweet-tempered, generous man, and she has regard and respect for him. Elizabeth is astonished. The housekeeper goes on to say that he is not only a good master, but a wonderful landlord, being extremely good to his tenants. She adds that he is unlike most other young men, being extremely unselfish. She also tells them that he is a devoted brother and does all he can for his sister's pleasure. As the group, that is Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner and Elizabeth, is looking over the grounds, they encounter Darcy, who have arrived unexpectedly early. Elizabeth is covered with confusion and vexation, lest he should think she has thrown herself in his way. Darcy speaks to her with gentleness. Elizabeth introduces him to the Gardiners, and she glories in every expression and every sentence of her uncle, which reflects his intelligence, his taste and his good manners. Mr. Darcy is altered in his manner, showing none of his proud arrogance. He is charming to the Gardiners, invites Mr. Gardiner to fish in his streams, and asks Elizabeth if they have left, if he may introduce her to his sister before they leave Pemberley. Okay, so who is anxious to meet her? That is, Miss Darcy is anxious to meet Elizabeth. When they have left Pemberley, the Gardiners are surprised that Elizabeth has described Darcy to be very disagreeable to them. Okay, and amazed that he could have been so cruel to Wickham. So this is completely juxtaposed. Elizabeth gives them to understand that Darcy is not to blame for the fact that Wickham did not receive the church endowment. Okay, Elizabeth spends the rest of the day thinking with wonder of Mr. Darcy's civility, and above all of his wishing her to meet his sister. So this chapter shows the beginning of Elizabeth's changing view of Darcy. She has already begun to see him in a new light since his letter of defense to her, but when she steps into the Pemberley estate, she really begins to perceive the true worth of Darcy. She is surprised to know from the housekeeper, Mrs. Reynolds, that Darcy is a fine master and a landlord with a great sense of responsibility towards his servants. She tells Elizabeth that Darcy has never said a cross word and that he is an affectionate brother. Far from being proud, it is his shy and reserved nature which prevents him from being friendly with strangers. Okay, so now you understand the reason behind his appearance, or reason behind his attitude, of which was considered to be which is considered to be a result of pride. Okay, Elizabeth thus begins to feel more gentle sensation towards Darcy. The sudden appearance of Darcy at Pemberley adds to Elizabeth's confusion and embarrassment. She finds him completely changed. The readers are later told that he is deeply affected by Elizabeth's accusation that he has acted in an ungentlemanlike manner, and decides to be as gentle as possible. He is thus very warm and friendly, and asks to be introduced to Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner. He invites Mr. Gardiner to fish at his estate and wants Elizabeth to be introduced to his sister Georgiana Darcy. Okay, Elizabeth is grateful that he has forgiven her. The Gardiners are also impressed with Darcy. What we see here is that a marvelous change has come over him by the time that has elapsed from the time of writing the letter, almost amounting to a metamorphosis. Elizabeth is struck by his politeness not only to herself but to her uncle and aunt. He pays a visit to her in the inn the very next day, as we will see, and asks her permission to introduce his sister to her. This takes Elizabeth entirely by surprise. She wonders whether it could be the same Darcy who had spoken haughtily to her at Rosings. Her attitude to him has changed by the time, and she has realized that he is blameless, at least in relation to Wickham. She has also realized that there is some truth in his judgment that Jane did not display her love for Bingley openly enough for the other to understand it clearly. This change in her attitude is strengthened by the housekeeper's strong praise of her master. Elizabeth remembers also that even Wickham had been spoken in praise by Darcy's affection and for his sister. Further, Elizabeth notes that Darcy keeps the miniature of Wickham exactly as it was in father's time, during his father's time, in spite of all that Wickham had done against him. She realizes Darcy's true nature. Her brutal frankness in pointing out to him his one weakness of pride has cured him of it. Okay, from that moment he is almost as polite and gentle, as friendly as his friend Bingley. Okay. In chapter 44, we see that Miss Darcy and her brother call on Elizabeth at the inn the next day. Georgiana Darcy, although only 16, has a well-formed figure and a womanly and graceful appearance. Her manners are unassuming and gentle. Shortly after the visitors have arrived, Bingley makes his appearance. He greets Elizabeth and the Gardiners with unaffected cordiality. and asks after the Bennet family in general. He hints at his disappointment at not having seen Jane for so long. Elizabeth cannot detect any signs of a romantic attachment between Bingley and Georgiana, which could justify Caroline's hopes. Okay, during the visit, Darcy's manners remain as much improved as they were on the previous day. Never at any time has Elizabeth seen him so anxious to please and so free from unbending reserve and everything. As the visitors depart, they express a wish to see the Gardiners and Elizabeth at dinner at Pemberley in next 2 days' time. The invitation is accepted, and Elizabeth lies awake for 2 hours that night, endeavoring to analyze her feelings for Darcy, which have certainly undergone a huge change. Okay, so this long series of misunderstanding that has been happening between Darcy and Elizabeth seems to be over. Elizabeth is well on her way to accept Darcy's good character unquestionably. Contrary to her expectations, Elizabeth finds Georgiana Darcy sweet and shy. This is a contrast to what Wickham has described her, discrediting Wickham further in her eyes. She is also happy to find that Bingley still has high regard for Jane and shows no sign of any great attachment towards Georgiana, as Caroline Bingley had hinted. This makes her hopeful of the future, but as the readers can see later, her hopes are dashed by the letter announcing Lydia's elopement, because it will bring a standstill to the reputation of the family. Okay, in those times, if a unmarried daughter elopes, then it would be a disgrace for the family, and it would be very difficult for them to be married off, right? In chapter 45, what we see here is that in the following morning, Elizabeth and her aunt pay a return call to Pemberley. They are received by Georgiana Darcy in a beautiful room where Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley are sitting. These two ladies greet Elizabeth and Mrs. Gardiner only by a courtesy. Miss Bingley watches Elizabeth closely, especially when she speaks to Miss Darcy. Refreshments are served, and while the party is having the refreshment, Darcy enters. He has left his fishing companions on hearing of Elizabeth's presence in his house. Miss Bingley makes a sneering remark to Elizabeth about the loss of the Bennets must feel the transfer of the militia. Georgiana is confused, and Darcy blushes at his ill-natured remark. Elizabeth receives this remark with composure, however, and both Georgiana and Darcy are calmed by Elizabeth's collected behavior. When the visitors have left, Caroline Bingley criticizes Elizabeth's appearance until Darcy is stung into retorting that he considers Elizabeth one of the handsomest women of his acquaintance. Okay, so in this chapter, Miss Caroline Bingley re-enters the novel. Highly jealous of Elizabeth, she makes disparaging allusion to Mr. Wickham in order to disgrace her in Darcy's eyes. Elizabeth, however, is unruffled and faces the situation with calm and boldness. Consequently, when Caroline expresses an unfavorable opinion of Elizabeth, Darcy says that the bad opinion of Elizabeth was only when I first knew her, for it is many months since I have considered her as one of the handsomest women in my acquaintance. Unquote. Okay, these lines epitomize the main theme of the book. For Jane Austen, a good marriage is always one where love is built on a firm foundation of experience and mutual understanding. This understanding grows and develops through the experiences that one goes through the things that one has faced. It is a love arrived at. Okay, so we are seeing that thing to happen in case of Darcy and Elizabeth, though it is a bit far till now, and one impediment is yet to be crossed. That impediment is mentioned in the next chapter. But what we will see that once this impediment of the Lydia Wickham elopement episode, this thing could have been a dangerous episode for them, right? But what we see here is that this will become a more fruitful one, and it will help them to be more close to each other. Okay, and Darcy will ultimately confess his love. In chapter 46, we will be informed about the Lydia Wickham elopement episode. Okay, so a day or two after the previous incident, Elizabeth receives a letter from Jane telling her the surprising news that Lydia has eloped with Wickham, leaving a note behind for Mrs. Foster. There is a second letter which is even more disturbing. Mr. Bennet and Colonel Foster have gone to London to try to trace her, but without much success. Colonel Foster has visited Longbourn to report that he is afraid Mr. Wickham neither wants to go to Scotland nor marry Lydia. Mr. Wickham is clearly not a person to be trusted. Jane's letter also requests Elizabeth to cut short her tour and return to Longbourn. So, Lydia's elopement is received with shock by Elizabeth. The elopement is important for the development of the Elizabeth-Darcy relationship. Darcy is silent on hearing the news, and Elizabeth is afraid that the disgrace of her family will lead Darcy to reject her. Okay. Darcy, on the other hand, is filled with tenderness for her. Elizabeth reveals the trust she now places in Darcy when she confides in him the news of Lydia's elopement. It is interesting that both blame each other for the present situation. Darcy feels he should have exposed Wickham earlier, but his family pride prevented it. Elizabeth too feels that she should have warned her family of Wickham's true nature. What we see here is that Jane Wickham clearly criticizes the failure of the Bennets as parents and lay the blame on them. Mr. Bennet, haunted by his neglect and mistaken indulgence, rouses himself and rushes to London in order to locate Lydia and Wickham. So, this incident will help in the development of the Darcy and Elizabeth relationship, when we will see that Darcy is not removing her affection from Elizabeth because of the disgrace that has been brought to the family. But on the other hand, she is being loved more, and Darcy is taking the steps to make the things fall into right places. Okay, in chapter 47, Elizabeth does not think that Wickham will marry the penniless Lydia and tells her uncle so as they leave Lambton. Her uncle does not agree with her. Jane, in her letter, expresses the conviction that the marriage will take place. Elizabeth tells her uncle and aunt both, that Lydia knows nothing of Wickham's infamous treatment of Darcy. They arrive home to find that there is not yet word of the fugitives. Although Mr. Bennet has written saying he has arrived safely in London. Mrs. Bennet is confined to her room, stricken by Lydia's behavior. She receives them with tears and lamentation. Mr. Gardiner tells her that he is going to London the next day and will help Mr. Bennet to recover Lydia. Lydia has left a letter to Mrs. Foster saying that she and Wickham are going to Gretna Green, and Jane shows it to Elizabeth. What we see here is that Elizabeth analyzes her family and exposes their faults with clear sense and judgment. She blames herself for having concealed Wickham's true nature, and having failed to warn Lydia before her trip to Brighton. It shows Elizabeth's progress towards wisdom and maturity, as also her concern for her sister. Mrs. Bennet is unable to cope with the crisis and suffers a nervous breakdown. Thus, both parents are shown as unequal to facing the situation. Jane Austen clearly indicts Mr. and Mrs. Bennet for the sorry state of affairs which has resulted in Lydia's elopement. Okay. In chapter 48, Mr. Gardiner leaves for London, but his wife remains at Longbourn a few days longer. A letter arrives from Mr. Gardiner saying that he and Mr. Bennet have not yet been successful in tracing Lydia. Mr. Collins, in the meantime, purports to be a condoling letter, but it is full of hurtful allusion allusions, many hurtful allusions to Lydia's disposition and upbringing. It is a kind of a self-gratulation that Elizabeth's denial of his proposal had providentially saved him from being tainted by their family disgrace. Okay, messages in the same strain from Lady Catherine Debog are included. Colonel Foster sends a letter to Mr. Gardiner telling him that Wickham has left considerable gaming and other debts behind him in Brighton. Mr. Gardiner persuades Mr. Bennet to return home. He is as composed as ever, but tells Elizabeth that he blames himself for Lydia's behavior. Mr. Bennet thus realizes his own mistake in indulging Lydia and accepts the blame. He has been ineffectual in tracing Lydia and comes back leaving everything in Mr. Gardiner's hand. He recognizes the good advice Elizabeth had given him, but which he had failed to act on the Lydia affair, occupying most of the final action in the novel, is important for a number of reasons. It emphasizes the theme of the individual responsibility towards the preservation of family honor and social norms. Acting selfishly, Lydia has jeopardized the chances of her sisters to settle down to respectable marriages and has tainted the family honor. Mr. Collins's letter expresses his sense of relief of having escaped this taint. Lady Catherine will use it later to prevent Darcy's marriage with Elizabeth. So what we see here is that one daughter's action is related with the future, related with the course of the luck that the other sisters are going to face. If by chance Lydia did not had a good marriage even after elopement, as for now they have not been traced, but as we know that they could be traced, they would be traced back. But if it had not been possible, then the future of all the sisters would be jeopardized. The family would be in disgrace, right? Chapter 49 describes that after 2 days of Mr. Bennet's returning home, he receives an express letter from Mr. Gardiner disclosing that Mr. Gardiner has found Lydia and Wickham in London. They are not married out. If Mr. Bennet will settle on his daughter her equal share of the £5,000 she should inherit after her father's death and allow her £100 a year, the marriage will take place. Okay, Mr. Gardiner goes on to say that Wickham's circumstances are not as bad as they thought, as there will be a little money over when his debts are paid to settle on Lydia. Okay, it appears from this letter that Wickham is not as undeserving as they thought, and Jane and Elizabeth urge their father to send back a favorable reply at once. Mr. Bennet consents, but is of the opinion that Mr. Gardiner has paid Wickham a sum of money to marry Lydia. Mr. Bennet puts the sum at not less than £10,000. Jane and Elizabeth are very relieved that the marriage will take place. Mrs. Bennet is acquainted with the news and can hardly contain herself, with joy. And what we see here is that she orders the carriage so that she may be driven to Meryton to tell the good news to Mrs. Phillips and the Lucases. The chapter ends here. The chapter presents a letter from Mr. Gardiner. Elizabeth realizes that Lydia does not care much whether she gets married or not, because she is enjoying all attention. Wickham's dishonorable nature is further revealed. His actions are definitely based on knowledge that he can blackmail Mr. Bennet to pay money and thus clear his debts. This again is a bad marriage based on economics, but in the reverse. It is Wickham who needs the money, not the other way around, not the wife. As in case of Charlotte, she needs the economic security, but here Wickham needs it. Mr. Gardiner, who has absolutely no regard for Lydia, strives to arrange the marriage only because he would not like the Bennet's stigma to affect the lives of his children. that Lydia selfishly does not recognize the repercussions of her elopement is a sign of her immaturity. In chapter 50, we see that Mr. Bennet regrets that he has not been more thrifty and laid money by so that Lydia need not have been indebted to her uncle for handing Wickham a sum of money, because Mr. Bennet guesses that Mr. Gardiner has paid a lump sum amount in order to get them married. Okay, he is determined to discover the amount and repay his brother-in-law as soon as he is able to do so. He writes to Mr. Gardiner for particulars of his indebtedness to him, but Mr. Gardiner requests him never to mention the financial arrangement again. After a fortnight's sojourn in her room, Mrs. Bennet is so recovered by the news of Lydia's prospective marriage that she again takes her seat at the head of the table and is in high spirits, allowing no shame to dampen her triumph at getting one of her daughters married. Mr. Bennet listens to her plans for the married couple in silence and then tells her that he will not receive either of them at Longbourn. This is followed by an argument, but Mr. Bennet is firm. Elizabeth now regrets that she has confided in Darcy. She knows that he is to be trusted, but she is ashamed that he should know of a family disgrace. She is now jealous of his esteem and realizes that he is just the man to make her a suitable husband, and that they would understand each other well. But she knows that she has discovered this too late. Mr. Gardiner writes that Wickham has decided to leave the militia and intends to go into a regiment now quartered in the north. Mr. Wickham's creditors at Brighton and Meryton are to be paid without delay. Lydia's uncle tells them that she begs to be allowed to see her family before leaving the south. Mr. Bennet at first rejects his daughter's request, but Jane and Elizabeth urge him to receive her and her husband at Longbourn. And Mr. Bennet writes to Mr. Gardiner giving his daughter and Wickham permission to come to Longbourn. It is arranged that as soon as the marriage ceremony is over, they will proceed to Longbourn. So Elizabeth and Jane is analyzing the situation. While analyzing the situation, they realize that Wickham will not marry Lydia for a small sum, and they conclude that Mr. Gardiner must have promised to pay off the large amount of debts Wickham has incurred. It is later learnt that this has been actually done by Mr. Darcy. An important feature of this chapter is that Elizabeth realizes that Darcy is just the man to make her a suitable husband. But in the light of Lydia's elopement, she is afraid that her love has no hope of being returned. Okay, as the disgrace has fallen on her family. Jane Austen reveals that the marriage of Darcy and Elizabeth, when it takes place, will be an example of true wedded bliss, since from her his manners would be improved, and from him Elizabeth could derive judgment, information, and knowledge of the world. So what we see here is that they are complementary to each other. These two people, Elizabeth and Darcy, are complementary to each other. They enhance each other. They show each other's faults, they remove each other's faults, and enhance the character of one another to be a better person, to be a better couple. Okay, so let's end it here today. We will continue in the next classes. Thank you.